What kind of child builds a house from garbage? Andean Highlands, Peru, winter of 2019. In a small mining village perched at 4,200 meters above sea level, where the air was thin and the winters were brutal and nothing came easy, a 12-year-old girl was building something from trash. While the other children played football in the dusty square or helped their parents with chores, Amara Quispe spent her afternoons collecting plastic bottles from the roadside, the creek bed, the dump behind the processing plant where the miners threw their lunch waste. She gathered them by the dozens, then the hundreds, carrying them in old rice sacks to the small plot of land behind her grandmother's house, where her dog Churro waited for her every day. They called her the bottle girl. They called her the trash collector. The other children laughed when she passed with her bulging sacks, and the adults shook their heads at the strange child who hoarded garbage instead of doing useful work. Her grandmother worried that the girl had been touched by the altitude sickness that sometimes affected people's minds at these heights. Her teachers wondered if she was falling behind in school because she spent so much time on her peculiar project. But that fool girl's bottle house, the one they said, was a pile of garbage that would blow away in the first strong wind. It would prove stronger than concrete, warmer than wood, and more resilient than any structure in the village when the mountain decided to move. What did she understand about air insulation, structural flexibility, and the physics of impact absorption that made her plastic bottle shelter the difference between life and death when the avalanche came? Amara had found Churro 2 years earlier, during the wet season, when mudslides turned the mountain roads into rivers of brown water. The puppy had been trapped in a drainage ditch, half drowned and shivering, his golden fur matted with mud and his eyes wild with fear. She had climbed down into the ditch despite her grandmother's shouting, wrapped the tiny creature in her school sweater, and carried him home against her chest. Her grandmother had said they couldn't keep him. They could barely feed themselves on her pension and the small income from selling herbs at the Sunday market. A dog was a luxury they couldn't afford. Another mouth that would eat food they didn't have. Another responsibility in a life already heavy with them. But Amara had begged. She had promised to find food for him herself, to take care of him without asking for help, to make sure he never became a burden. And her grandmother, who had lost her own daughter, Amara's mother, to the mines 3 years before, couldn't refuse the child who had already lost so much. Churro grew from a mud-covered puppy into a large, golden-furred dog with gentle eyes and a tail that never stopped wagging when Amara was near. He slept at the foot of her bed, walked her to school every morning, waited at the gate every afternoon until she returned. He was her companion, her confidant, the one living creature who loved her without conditions or complications. But Churro couldn't sleep inside when winter came. The house was small, 2 rooms for Amara, her grandmother, and her uncle who worked in the mines. There was no space for a large dog, and her uncle complained about the smell and the hair and the muddy paw prints on the floor he had to walk across to reach his bed after 12-hour shifts underground. The dog would have to sleep outside, he declared, or the dog would have to go. Amara had tried to build Churro a shelter from scraps, wooden boards salvaged from the dump, sheets of corrugated metal that had blown off a storage shed, plastic tarps weighted down with stones. But the winter winds at 4,200 meters were merciless. They tore apart her first shelter in 3 days. Her second attempt lasted a week before a heavy snowfall collapsed the roof. Her third design, more ambitious but still flawed, leaked cold air through every gap and left Churro shivering on the warmest nights. She needed something different, something that could withstand wind and snow and cold, something she could build without money, without tools, without help from adults who thought she was wasting her time. The idea came from a video she watched on the old smartphone her grandmother used for calls. A school in the Philippines had built an entire classroom from plastic bottles filled with sand, the bottles laid like bricks and held together with mud and wire. The building was strong enough to withstand typhoons, the video said, strong enough to keep students safe when the storms came. If bottles could protect children from typhoons, they could protect Churro from the mountain winter. Amara began collecting bottles the next day. The village produced plenty of plastic waste, soda bottles and water bottles and juice containers, tossed aside by miners who had no recycling program and no reason to care about garbage that would eventually wash down the mountain in the spring rains. Amara collected them all, sorting by size and type, cleaning them in the creek and letting them dry in the thin mountain sunshine. The design she developed over several weeks of experimentation was simpler than the Philippine school, but based on the same principles. Each bottle would be filled with sand and small stones, transforming the thin plastic into a solid building unit that weighed nearly 2 kilograms. The bottles would be laid in rows, alternating direction to create an interlocking pattern, and bound together with wire salvaged from the dump. Layer by layer, the walls would rise until they formed a dome-shaped shelter just large enough for Churro to curl up inside. The dome shape was important. Amara had learned that much from watching her grandmother build bread ovens from adobe bricks. A dome distributed weight evenly, had no corners where wind could catch, and was naturally stable, without requiring the wooden frames that other structures needed. A dome made of bottles would flex slightly under pressure, absorbing impacts that would shatter rigid walls. She tested her theories on small models first, building miniature domes from small water bottles and seeing how they responded to weight and pressure. She dropped rocks on them, pushed them with sticks, buried them in sand, and dug them out again. The models that survived became templates for the full-size structure. The ones that failed taught her what not to do. The wire connections were crucial. Too tight, and the bottles couldn't flex when pressure came. Too loose, and the structure had no integrity. Amara experimented with different patterns, crossing the wire in X shapes, spiraling it around each bottle, weaving it through the dome like the threads of a basket. The basket weave pattern worked best, creating a mesh that held the bottles together while still allowing movement. She worked every afternoon after school and all day on weekends. Her fingers grew raw from twisting wire. Her back ached from carrying sand. Her grandmother watched with growing concern as the strange structure took shape in the backyard. A lumpy, colorful dome of plastic that looked like nothing anyone in the village had ever seen. The other children were the cruelest. "Amara's building a spaceship from garbage," they shouted. "Amara's making a house for rats." They threw stones at the structure when she wasn't watching, trying to knock bottles loose. They told her that dogs didn't need houses, that she was crazy, that she should stop embarrassing herself and do something normal for once. The adults weren't much better. Her uncle called the project a waste of time that could be spent on useful work. The neighbors complained that the bottle structure was an eyesore that lowered the value of their properties. As if any property in a mining village at 4,200 meters had value to begin with. Even her grandmother, who tried to be supportive, couldn't hide her concern that Amara was becoming obsessed with something that would never work. "The bottles will crack in the cold," her grandmother said. "The sand will freeze and expand and break them apart. You'll wake up one morning and find your dog buried in plastic garbage." "The air in the bottles is the insulation," Amara explained, repeating what she had learned from hours of research on her grandmother's phone. "Not the sand. The sand just makes them heavy so they don't blow away. The air trapped in the parts without sand, that's what keeps the heat in." Her grandmother didn't understand. Neither did anyone else. But Amara kept building. By the end of April, just before the winter storms began in earnest, the bottle house was complete. It stood 3 feet high at its peak, with walls 18 inches thick made from over 300 plastic bottles. The entrance faced away from the prevailing wind, protected by a curved wall that forced air to flow around rather than through. The floor was lined with layers of cardboard and old blankets, creating insulation from the frozen ground below. Churro investigated his new home with the cautious curiosity of a dog who has learned not to trust human constructions. He sniffed every bottle, circled the interior 3 times, and finally lay down on the blanket-covered floor with a sigh that might have been contentment or resignation. That night, the temperature dropped to minus 15 degrees Celsius. Amara woke before dawn, terrified that she would find Churro frozen in his plastic shelter. She ran outside in her nightclothes, the cold biting at her exposed skin, and crawled through the entrance to find her dog warm and comfortable, his body heat trapped by the dome of air-filled bottles that surrounded him. She pressed her hand against the inner wall of the shelter. It was cool, but not cold, at least 15 degrees warmer than the outside air. The bottles had done exactly what she had hoped, creating a barrier of trapped air that slowed heat transfer in both directions. Churro's body heat, combined with the insulation of the walls, had created a microclimate inside the dome that was survivable even when the outside temperature dropped to deadly levels. The bottle house worked. Winter settled over the village with the weight of a stone. Snow fell, melted, fell again. The temperature swung between merely cold and dangerously frozen. The wind came down from the peaks like a living thing, finding every crack in every building, stealing heat from every structure that dared to stand against it. Amara checked Churro's shelter every morning and every night. The dog was always warm, always comfortable, always waiting for her with his tail wagging and his eyes bright. The bottles showed no signs of cracking despite the freeze-thaw cycles that damaged concrete and split wooden beams. The dome held its shape despite winds that knocked down fences and tore sheets of metal from roofs. The children stopped laughing. The adults stopped complaining. The structure that everyone had called garbage was proving itself night after night, storm after storm, surviving conditions that tested every building in the village. But the real test was still coming. July brought the deep winter, the coldest weeks of the year when even the mines sometimes closed because the roads became impassable. The snow accumulated on the peaks above the village, layer upon layer of white that grew deeper with each passing storm. The old people watched the mountains and muttered about the weight of the snowpack, about slopes that looked unstable, about avalanches they remembered from their youth. Amara didn't understand the danger. She was 12 years old, born after the last major slide, too young to remember the stories, except as distant tales that adults told to frighten children into staying away from the steep places. She knew that avalanches happened, that they were dangerous, that people sometimes died, but she didn't know what that meant. Not really. Not in the way that someone who has seen a mountain move understands it. The avalanche came on a Tuesday morning, just after dawn. There was no warning. One moment the village was quiet, wrapped in the gray light of early morning, the smoke from cooking fires rising straight in the still air. The next moment there was a sound, a crack like thunder, followed by a roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, a noise so deep and powerful that it vibrated in the chest rather than the ears. Amara was inside the house, helping her grandmother prepare breakfast when the sound reached them. Her grandmother's face went white. "Avalanche," the old woman said. "Get under the table, now." The snow hit the village like a wave hitting a beach. Not the whole village, Not the center where most of the houses stood, but the upper edge where the poorest families lived closest to the mountain's face. Amara's grandmother's house was on that edge. The backyard, where Churro's bottle shelter stood, was directly in the path. The impact lasted perhaps 3 seconds. The noise was indescribable. A roar of displaced air and tumbling snow and breaking structures, all compressed into a moment that seemed to stretch forever. The house shook but held, protected partially by the neighbor's concrete wall that diverted the main flow. But through the small kitchen window, Amara saw the white wave roll over the backyard, burying everything in its path. When the noise stopped, she was already running. Her grandmother screamed for her to stop, to wait, to let the adults check for secondary slides. But Amara couldn't wait. Churro was out there, buried under the snow that had swallowed the backyard, and every second she delayed was a second he couldn't breathe. She hit the snow with her bare hands, digging like an animal, throwing handfuls of white powder behind her as she fought toward the place where the bottle house had stood. The snow was heavy, packed by the force of the slide, and her fingers went numb within seconds. But she kept digging. She found plastic first, a bottle, still attached to the structure, protruding from the snow at an angle. Then another. Then the curve of the dome, compressed but intact, the bottles pushed inward by the impact, but not crushed. The flexible structure bending rather than breaking. Amara dug faster. Her uncle appeared beside her, then her grandmother, then neighbors who had seen the girl running and followed to help. Together, they cleared the snow from around the bottle shelter, revealing a structure that had been pushed 3 feet from its original position, but remained essentially whole. The entrance was blocked by packed snow. Amara's uncle used a shovel to clear it, while Amara called Churro's name over and over, her voice breaking with terror. The snow fell away from the entrance. Inside, in the dim light that filtered through the translucent bottles, Churro stood up and shook himself. He was unharmed. The dome had protected him completely, flexing under the impact of the avalanche instead of shattering. The bottles absorbing the force of the snow rather than transmitting it to the interior. Amara crawled through the entrance and wrapped her arms around her dog. She was crying. She realized that only later, when the tears had frozen on her cheeks and someone had wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and led her back to the house that was suddenly full of neighbors who wanted to see the miracle for themselves. Churro licked her face, his tail wagging as if nothing unusual had happened, as if being buried under an avalanche and surviving was just another morning in the mountains. He didn't understand what had almost happened to him. He didn't know that the bottle shelter had saved his life, that the flexible dome had absorbed an impact that destroyed concrete walls just meters away. He only knew that Amara was here, that she was crying, and that crying meant she needed comfort. That night, Amara's grandmother let Churro sleep inside for the first time since winter began. Her uncle didn't complain. No one said anything about the smell or the hair or the muddy paw prints. The dog who had been saved by a trash house had earned his place, and everyone knew it. The bottle house had survived an avalanche. The news spread through the village within hours. People came to see the structure, to touch the bottles that had withstood forces that destroyed concrete walls, to ask Amara how she had known to build it this way. She didn't have a good answer. She had built what she could afford with what she could find, and it had worked because physics didn't care whether a structure was made from expensive materials or garbage. The avalanche had damaged 14 buildings in the village. 3 houses were completely destroyed, their walls shattered by the force of the moving snow. The concrete retaining wall behind Amara's grandmother's house, The one that should have protected the backyard had cracked in 2 places and would need to be rebuilt. A storage shed made from corrugated metal had been flattened entirely, its contents scattered across the slope below. But the bottle house, made from trash by a 12-year-old girl, had survived with nothing more than a few bottles knocked loose from the outer layer. An engineer from the mining company came 3 days later, summoned by the village council to assess the damage from the avalanche and make recommendations for rebuilding. He spent an hour examining the bottle shelter, taking photographs, asking Amara questions about her construction methods. "The principle is sound," he explained to the gathered adults, many of whom had mocked the structure just weeks before. "The bottles filled with sand provide mass that anchors the structure. The bottles filled with air provide insulation and cushioning. The dome shape distributes force evenly, and the flexible connections between bottles allow the structure to deform under impact without catastrophic failure." He paused, looking at Amara with an expression that mixed professional interest with something like respect. A rigid structure in the same position would have been destroyed completely. The concrete wall next to it was shattered. But this— he gestured at the bottle dome. This bent instead of breaking. The avalanche pushed it, compressed it, buried it. But it held together. It protected what was inside. The children who had thrown stones at the shelter were quiet now. The adults who had complained about the eyesore found other things to discuss. Amara's grandmother, who had worried that her granddaughter was wasting time on foolishness, began telling anyone who would listen about the clever girl who had saved her dog with nothing but garbage and determination. The engineer returned a month later with colleagues from a university in Lima. They wanted to study the bottle structure, to understand how it had survived forces that destroyed conventional buildings. They asked Amara's permission to photograph it, to measure it, to write papers about it for scientific journals. "You built something remarkable," one of the researchers told her. "Not because it's beautiful or expensive, but because it works. Because you understood principles that engineers study for years, and you applied them with materials that cost nothing." Amara didn't feel remarkable. She had built a house for her dog because she loved him and couldn't afford anything else. The science had been an accident, discovered through trial and error rather than calculation. But the result was the same. Churro was alive, the shelter had proved itself, and people who had laughed at her were now asking her advice. That spring, Amara helped 3 other families build bottle structures for their animals. Simple domes, similar to Churro's shelter, using the same techniques she had developed over months of experimentation. The structures weren't beautiful. They looked exactly like what they were, collections of plastic bottles held together with wire and hope. But they were strong, they were warm, and they cost almost nothing to build. The village council discussed using bottle construction for larger projects, storage buildings, animal shelters, perhaps even emergency housing for families displaced by future avalanches. The engineer from the mining company offered to help develop standardized designs that could be built by anyone with access to plastic waste and a willingness to work. Amara listened to the discussions without saying much. She was still 12, still a child in a village where children were expected to be quiet while adults talked. But when people asked her opinion, she gave it clearly and without hesitation. "The bottles are everywhere," she said. "They wash down the mountain every spring, thousands of them. We can either let them pile up and pollute the water, or we can use them to build things that protect us. It's not complicated. You just have to be willing to try." Churro lived for another 9 years, dying peacefully in his bottle house at the age of 11. By then, the original structure had been rebuilt twice, each time larger and more sophisticated, incorporating improvements that Amara developed as she grew from a child into a young woman studying engineering at the university in Arequipa. she never forgot where she came from. Every summer, she returned to the village, bringing new ideas and new techniques, helping families build structures that cost nothing but could survive conditions that defeated expensive construction. The bottle houses became a signature of the village, strange and colorful structures that visitors photographed and locals defended with pride. They had laughed at the trash collector. They had called her building garbage. They had said it would blow away in the first wind, collapse under the first snow, fail when it was needed most. But the bottle house had survived an avalanche, and the girl who built it had proved that the best solutions don't always come from money or expertise. Sometimes they come from love, from necessity, from a child who refused to let her dog freeze and found a way to protect him with nothing but garbage and determination. Some lessons take a long time to learn. Some people never learn them at all. But Churro knew. Churro always knew. And every night for 9 years, he curled up in his house of bottles and slept warm while the wind howled and the snow fell and the mountain watched over the village where a 12-year-old girl had proved that trash could save a life. The bottles are still there if you know where to look. A dome of plastic and wire and stubborn hope, standing in a backyard at 4,200 meters, waiting to protect whatever needs protecting. That's what Amara built. That's what love looks like when it has nothing but garbage and refuses to give up. And somewhere in the Andes, at 4,200 meters above sea level, a girl who was once called the trash collector is now called something else entirely. They call her the engineer. They call her the bottle builder. They call her the one who proved that the best ideas don't always come from universities or corporations. Sometimes they come from a child who loves her dog and refuses to let him freeze. Some lessons are worth more than any degree, and Amara learned hers at 12 years old, one bottle at a time, while the whole village laughed. They're not laughing anymore.